Welcome to the latest episode of Management Unplugged by Garang Rathod. We're diving into a really crucial topic today, one that forces us, I think, to rethink how major global companies approach working conditions and their huge supply chains. It's such a complex challenge, often hidden thousands of miles from headquarters. And the traditional ways of dealing with it, well, they often seem to fall short. Okay, so let's kind of dig into this. For years, multinational corporations have relied pretty heavily on codes of conduct and monitoring systems, audits, checklists, that kind of thing. It's their main tool, really, to ensure labor standards are met by suppliers, especially in developing countries. The thinking is if you collect information about compliance problems through these audits, it'll pressure both the brands and the suppliers to fix things. That was logical enough, right? But does this actually work on the ground? And maybe more importantly, how well do these systems truly measure what's really happening inside a factory, beyond the paperwork? We're going to take a deep dive into a real-world case study today that shines a bright and maybe sometimes uncomfortable light on exactly these questions.
Yeah, and that whole system of private voluntary regulation, it partly came about because, let's face it, governments in many production countries just have limited capacity. They struggle to fully enforce their own national labor laws sometimes. So the brands stepped in. They developed their own codes of conduct, made suppliers sign them, post them, make them visible. And then came the monitoring, usually audits, often by third parties. The core idea, the assumption really, was that this information gathering would create enough transparency and pressure to actually drive change. NGOs could use the findings to pressure the brands, and the brands would use them to, well, police the suppliers, threatening to pull orders if issues weren't fixed, and fixed fast.
And yet, despite decades of this approach, we still see these persistent problems, don't we? Things like excessive hours, really low wages, sometimes unsafe environments cropping up again and again in global supply chains. So the big question is, why has relying mainly on monitoring compliance with these private codes been so, well, challenging?
That's the absolute central puzzle this case helps us get our heads around. A key limitation, it seems, lies in the nature of the standard audit itself. Even the rigorous ones, they often become heavily focused on documentation, on records. They might involve, brief site visits, maybe some interviews with workers. But think about it, if those interviews happen inside the factory, maybe with management hanging around, or if workers are just scared of retaliation.
Right. They're not going to speak freely, are they? Their job could be on the line.
Exactly. So these methods can easily miss the complex, sometimes messy reality of daily life on the factory floor. It's kind of like trying to understand how a restaurant really runs and what the morale is like just by looking at its health inspection certificate and the payroll records. You get a snapshot of formal compliance, sure, but you don't really grasp the lived reality. You miss how the kitchen staff actually interact, the real pressures, the underlying culture.
Okay, here's where this specific case gets really interesting, I think. It brings this exact problem into sharp focus by looking at two actual factories. So imagine two facilities, both in Mexico, making T-shirts for the same huge global brand, a massive player in athletic wear, everyone knows them. These factories, they operated under the same Mexican labor laws, dealt with the same regional office of this brand, and they were subject to audits using the brand's standard tools. Everything seemed level.
And on paper, based on the brand's main audit tool, let's call it the M audit, it gives a single score out of 100 QUEL. These two factories looked almost identical, like eerily similar. One factory, we'll call it Plant A, got a score of 87. The other, Plant B, scored an 86, just 1 point difference. So purely looking at those numbers, you'd absolutely expect the working conditions inside those plants to be pretty much the same, wouldn't you?
You totally would. 1 point. That implies they're operating at basically the same standard. But the reality, which came out through deeper investigation, was dramatically different. Let's compare them on a few key things. Take wages, for example. Both plants legally paid the minimum wage required by Mexican law. That box was ticked. But workers at Plant A earned significantly more on average, around $85.50 a week compared to Plant B's roughly $68. That's a 21% difference in actual take-home pay. That's huge.
And that big difference in wages wasn't just about, meeting the minimum. It really came down to how pay was structured beyond that minimum threshold. Plan A used a system with a fixed daily wage, plus bonuses for things like attendance, punctuality, and crucially productivity bonuses based on the team's collective output. And since most teams at Plan A were highly productive, most workers actually earned close to their full potential bonus. It really boosted their overall pay packet. Now, at Plant B, while they also had hourly wages and bonuses, those bonuses were based purely on individual productivity. This piece rate focus, even though the minimum wage was the same, resulted in a much lower average weekly salary for the workers there.
Wow. So the way the bonus system was set up, team versus individual, directly impacted how much people could earn, even when the base legal requirement was met. That's fascinating. And it seems like it ties into employee satisfaction, too, and how the work itself felt. You mentioned workers at Plant A reported much higher satisfaction.
They did. They worked in teams or cells. They learned to operate multiple types of sewing machines. They even did some basic maintenance on their own equipment. Interviews showed they really valued the job rotation, the chance to gain different skills. They felt more engaged.
And Plant B.
A completely different story. At Plant B, workers were stuck in fixed individual stations, specializing in one very narrow task like sewing only collars or only sleeves all day, every day. The interviews revealed they felt zero motivation to learn new skills. Why would they? Their entire focus was just intensely maximizing their output on that single, repetitive task to boost their individual piece rate bonus. It created a very different feeling, a different work experience.
And worker participation, does that follow the same pattern?
It tells a very similar story about the overall environment, yes. Plant A seemed to foster a more collaborative culture. Workers actually had input on things like production targets, scheduling. They could even suggest changes to operations to make them faster or easier. And management seemed genuinely open to their ideas, which, likely improved the whole work climate.
Whereas Plant B
Was strictly top-down, a very rigid hierarchy. Production orders came from management, period. Workers just followed precise instructions, zero opportunity for input. One worker's quote really stuck out, capturing it perfectly. "We cannot change or suggest different ways to produce a garment because it is a chain and we need to follow what they tell us." They felt like cogs in a machine, not contributors.
And then there's the overtime issue. That's always a huge red flag in supply chain labor discussions. The brand's code and local law, they limited the work week, including overtime, to 60 hours. How did the plants handle that?
Again, a stark contrast. Plant A managed overtime voluntarily. They'd ask workers if they wanted extra hours when needed, and crucially, it stayed within the legal and code limits. Plant B, however, saw forced overtime as just the norm. Supervisors decided who had to stay late, often with little or no notice, and multiple workers reported regularly working over that 60-hour limit.
Okay, but wait. You said this excessive forced overtime. The audit actually picked it up at Plant B.
Yes, and here's the real kicker. It was noted in the standard M audit for Plant B, yet despite being a pretty serious issue, right, it didn't drag their overall numeric score down enough to make them look significantly worse than Plant A. Remember, Plant A had voluntary limited overtime, but the scores were 86 versus 87.
So how on earth is that possible? How could two places with such dramatically different realities for the people working there? I mean, differences in wages, job satisfaction, input, whether overtime was forced or voluntary. How could they end up with almost the exact same score on a supposedly rigorous audit meant to measure compliance? This is the core puzzle, isn't it? What exactly was that audit really measuring?
Well, the M audit tool, it was designed to assess a really wide range of labor practices and conditions, over 80 items, I think. And it aggregated everything into that single numeric score based on the percentage of items found compliant. However, the way it was structured and the way it was scored heavily privileged documentary evidence. Proven record keeping looked really good. Plant B, for instance, had immaculate records. Their documentation was perfect on paper. Plant A, ironically, actually had some minor issues, like maybe having certain policies formally written down, like their non-discrimination policy, even if they clearly practiced it.
Okay. So Plant B looks great on paper, which is where the audit put most of its weight, even if the actual conditions, the lived experience was much harsher.
Precisely. While Plant A might have had a few documentation gaps, Plant B had these severe, undeniable issues hitting workers daily, like the documented excessive forced overtime, and there were even reports of verbal abuse by supervisors, which Plant A didn't have. But the audit scoring system, because it aggregated everything and weighted that documentation so heavily, it effectively masked these crucial qualitative differences. Different kinds of problems ended up yielding similar overall numbers. It just obscured the severity of the issues in Plant B. It really highlighted the limits of audits that are, time-bound and rely so much on evidence that can be easily faked or just doesn't reflect reality.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now. The metric itself, or at least how it weighted things, was kind of flawed. But the brand did use another tool, didn't they? Something more subjective.
Yes, thankfully they did. So in addition to that M audit score, The global brand also used a subjective compliance rating grade. It was an A through D scale, and it factored in all the information they had access to. That included the numeric audit score, sure, but also the auditor's broader, more qualitative impressions of management's whole approach. Plus, visits by operational managers, other reports, everything went into the mix. And on this subjective rating, Plant A received a B, which meant, minor issues, but no critical flaws. Plant B, however, received a D. That indicated one or more serious systemic issues, and they specifically cited the excess overtime as a major problem.
That distinction is absolutely critical. The subjective rating, the one that allowed for more holistic judgment by people who presumably had a broader feel for the place, it gave a far more realistic picture of the actual conditions and the underlying problems than the purely numeric documentation-heavy audit did.
Exactly right. While Plant B might have technically followed the code on many points, maybe even offered some benefits, Plan A didn't like on-site daycare, which was a plus. That D rating just cut through the noise. It captured the fundamental, serious issues like forced overtime that the numeric score completely obscured. It really underscores that judging compliance just by ticking boxes on a form, well, it misses the forest for the trees. And the point here isn't necessarily to just label one plant good and the other bad across the board. It's more about highlighting the vastly different approaches to managing people and dealing with labor standards and how those standard audits just fail to capture that difference.
Right. So if the audit scores were so similar and the external pressures from the brand and the law were supposedly the same, what really explains these fundamental differences in conditions and management style between Plant A and Plant B? What's fascinating here, maybe the deepest insight from this whole case, is that a key factor seems to be how the work itself was organized. And even more fundamentally, how management viewed their employees. Is that right?
Absolutely spot on. Plant A had deliberately, consciously transitioned towards a lean manufacturing system. This meant organizing workers into teams, these production cells. It emphasized multi-skilling workers learning multiple tasks. It built in flexibility. Now, this required a significant investment in training workers. It wasn't cheap or easy, but critically, it seemed to stem from a fundamental belief system in management. They saw workers not just as labor costs, but as valuable assets, as individuals who should be developed, empowered, involved in solving problems. They even explicitly stated their philosophy: we want people here to feel important. And this approach didn't just improve efficiency and quality, which it did, but it also created better working conditions and higher earning potential for the workers. It was a win-win.
So the decision to adopt that specific production system, lean manufacturing, it was deeply tangled up with, maybe even driven by, their underlying philosophy about people.
Precisely. It wasn't just a technical choice about production flow. It was a strategic human resource choice, rooted in a particular worldview about work and workers. Plant B, in stark contrast, used a much more traditional assembly line-based modular system. This system is really rooted in those old principles of scientific management from, the early 20th century. It focuses heavily on breaking down tasks into the smallest, simplest bits, demanding extreme specialization and maintaining tight hierarchical control. And management there viewed workers primarily as a cost, something to be minimized. The head of operations was remarkably blunt about it. He basically said, it's all about lowering the price of labor and increasing the quantity produced. He even suggested they'd just pack up and move production elsewhere if they couldn't keep cutting labor costs. There was no worker input sought or valued. Control was everything.
Wow, that difference in management philosophy. Viewing workers as assets to develop versus seeing them mainly as a cost to cut. That really does seem like a fundamental driver of the huge difference in conditions, maybe even more important than the specifics of the production system itself.
I think it is. This case isn't just about whether lean is better than modular per se. It's about the underlying assumptions managers hold about human motivation, about capability at work, and how those assumptions profoundly shape every decision about training, participation, control, and ultimately the quality of the work environment itself. As, organizational theory has shown for decades, how companies organize work reflects managers' core beliefs. Do they believe workers are reluctant types needing constant control? Or are they individuals motivated to contribute and solve problems if you value them, train them, empower them? Plant A and Plant B are just perfect real-world illustrations of these two opposing worldviews in action, and the outcomes for workers were dramatically different.
Okay, and there's another layer here too, right? The relationship between the factory management and the global brand's local team, that also played a part.
A significant part, yes. Plant A actively cultivated a close, collaborative, and trusting relationship with the brand's regional office. They had frequent visits, they worked together openly to solve problems when they cropped up. And the brand actually supported Plan A through that costly, difficult transition to the new lean work system. They offered technical help. They genuinely seemed to see each other as partners trying to improve things.
In Plan B's relationship.
Much more formal, more distant. Despite being designated a strategic partner on paper, part of it was geography, sure, but it also stemmed from a less trusting dynamic overall. Communication was often remote, less personal. Plant B seemed to view the brand primarily as just a buyer, someone whose fluctuating demands had to be met no matter what to get future orders, even if that meant pushing workers way too hard. The brand, in turn, saw Plant B as, yeah, technically good at making stuff, but consistently weak on compliance issues like that overtime problem. It really exemplifies that common low-trust trap you often see in supply chains, where brands and suppliers get stuck in this adversarial cycle, blaming each other instead of actually working together on the root causes of the problems.
And the experience at Plant A really showed that breaking out of that trap is possible, and that a more open, trusting partnership between the brand and the supplier can benefit everyone involved, including, most importantly, the workers on the ground.
And what's really interesting here is that partly because of these kinds of findings, seeing the clear limitations of just relying on monitoring the global brand in this specific case actually did start shifting its approach. They began supplementing those traditional audits with more collaborative efforts. Initiatives aimed at sharing better workplace management practices among their suppliers. They even started looking inward, which is crucial, reviewing their own internal business processes. Things like product development timelines, purchasing practices. Asking themselves, are we unintentionally driving suppliers to push for excessive overtime just to meet our tight deadlines?
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for brands, for managers, even for policymakers, trying to genuinely improve conditions in these vast global supply chains? The case makes a powerful argument, I think, that the traditional model, just policing suppliers through audits, isn't enough on its own. It's necessary maybe for identifying problems, but it doesn't actually fix them.
Exactly. A more effective model, the one strongly suggested by this case study, involves global brands moving beyond just monitoring, moving towards actively providing technical and organizational help to suppliers.
Like actually helping them implement better management systems.
Yes, systems that tackle the root causes of poor conditions. Integrating labor standards right into the core of how work is organized and managed day to day, not just treating them as some external compliance checklist you deal with separately when the auditors show up.
You know, this whole trajectory sounds incredibly similar to how major issues like workplace safety or equal opportunity evolved in places like the US or Europe, doesn't it? First, there was external pressure, then rules, regulations, monitoring. But the real widespread lasting change happened when companies started integrating those concerns into their fundamental management systems, into their daily operations. When they found ways to make safer, more equitable workplaces a source of competitive advantage, not just a regulatory burden they had to bear.
I think that's a perfect analogy. Improving global supply chain conditions probably needs a similar journey. Monitoring still plays a role, of course. You need that visibility, you need to know what's happening, but it absolutely has to be combined with active support to change management practices on the ground. And this could also involve working more closely with local unions, with NGOs, maybe even with governments to build up their capacity to participate in and oversee these improvements too. The focus has to shift, fundamentally, from just checking for compliance with codes to actually transforming the underlying management systems that create either empowering, productive workplaces or exploitative ones.
It's definitely a complex challenge, no easy answers. But this case study provides such a clear roadmap, doesn't it? Showing that focusing on how work is organized and, crucially, how management views its workforce. That can be the key to unlocking real, sustainable improvements. It's not just about the audits. It's about the management philosophy underneath it all and the quality of the relationships built along the chain. So reflecting on all of this, what truly needs to change if we are serious about improving labor conditions, not just having the right documents filed away, but improving the actual lived experience on the factory floor. See you later. Bye-bye.